Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Great to have you all here and to have such a full Zoom room. So delighted that you're here. I'm Lisa McMullen. I'm a trustee at Writing on the Wall, or Writing on the Wall, I should say. Before we get started, I just want to welcome you all. And please, we want you to be as comfortable and as engaged as you would like to be this evening. You're welcome to keep your cameras on. It would be lovely to see your faces, but equally, we know that it might be more appropriate for you to keep your camera off. We'll have opportunities once we have heard from Rebecca and Chitra and shortly to ask any questions. Feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak. You can use the reaction icon at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the chat box if you prefer to do that. If it's not working for you, please just actively wave and we will keep an eye on cameras and make sure that you get your chance to ask any questions. So, without any further ado, let me get started. And on behalf of the Writing on the Wall and the Board of Trustees, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to tonight's online event with Rebecca Solnit. And our event this evening is called The Beginning Comes After the End. Notes on a World of Change. I see a note that there's an echo. I just want to make sure, is it mine? Can you hear okay, Robin? Yeah, okay. So it's maybe just if you want to keep your microphones on mute, it'll just help us as we go through. So from a Writing on the Wall point of view, just let me continue with that. For over 25 years, Writing on the Wall has created space for conversations that matter. Conversations rooted in literature, activism, community, and the belief that words can help us understand and indeed reshape the world around us. And tonight's event sits beautifully with this tradition. Rebecca Solnit is one of the most important and influential writers of our time. And aren't we so privileged to have you here tonight, Rebecca? Thank you. An essayist, historian, and activist whose work has illuminated the connections between storytelling, social change, and collective hope. From Men Explain Things to Me to Hope in the Dark, her writing reminds us that history is not fixed, that change is possible, and that even in uncertain times, new beginnings are always taking shape. The title of tonight's event, The Beginning Comes After the End, feels especially resonant in a world marked by profound political, environmental, and social change. It invites us to think about what emerges from disruption and how we might actively participate in shaping more just and imaginative futures. And we're also delighted that tonight's conversation will be chaired by the wonderful Chitra Ramaswamy, author and journalist, and a writer whose own work combines sharp political insight with humanity and compassion. Chitra, we're delighted that you're chairing tonight's conversation. We're thrilled to have you guiding what promises to be a rich and thoughtful discussion. And thank you all to our audience, to everyone who's joined us this evening, wherever you are from or watching from, and for continuing to support Writing on the Wall and these vital conversations that we're very proud to host. And now it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Chitra to begin tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chitra Ramaswamy. I'm an author and journalist, and it really is my great honor to be here this evening in conversation with Rebecca Solnit. Rebecca Solnit is one of the great writers of our age. In a career spanning more than 3 decades, she's written about our times with a deep curiosity, fierce hope, and an unwavering passion for justice. Her books have ranged across subjects including environmental and Indigenous movements, art, walking, feminism, George Orwell's love of gardening, nature, culture, and history. What's emerged over time is a profound poetics of resistance, characterized by exhilarating, expansive, and galvanizing thinking. I get so excited reading her books, and I'm not sure how many other writers, trafficking in this kind of subject matter you can say that of. Um, they represent an embrace of the unknown and the deep wells of hope that she continues to draw from the past. The beginning comes after the end continues that lifelong work, coming 22 years after she first made the case for hope in Hope in the Dark. It's a powerful successor to that small but mighty book. No less beautifully articulated, timely, epic in scale, or necessary. In this book, Solnit surveys a world that has changed incrementally yet dramatically from the one into which she was born several decades ago. The beginning comes after the end, which gathers voices and stories from across intersectional movements and indeed across time, is a kind of reframing of mainstream narratives in the global north. And to me, above all, it's a love letter to interconnection. I actually reviewed this book for a organization called Writers' Mosaic, which is a division of the Royal Literary Fund dedicated to platforming writers of the global majority. And so I thought I'd close with my final paragraph from that review before Rebecca reads to us from the book, and then we'll be in conversation. The multitudinous ways in which the long arc of history bends towards justice have been Solnit's lifelong preoccupation. I have seen history unfold, she writes, and this witness has been one of the things that brings purpose and exhilaration to my life as a writer and a citizen of this earth. I have seen change. The beginning comes after the end, invites the reader to witness this change shoulder to shoulder with one of the great thinkers of our age, and to share in the collective purpose and exhilaration. In that way, and so many others, the revolution has already begun. Rebecca, welcome. I think you are still on mute.
Oh, not anymore. Thank you so much, Chitra. It's wonderful to be with you again. Wonderful to almost nearly be in Liverpool. Hearing all these accents makes me wish I was over there. But I'm in a borrowed house in New Mexico at the moment, which I can't really complain about. And one of the things I want to say about this book before I read to you a bit is, in a way, it's about hope, but hope is about what comes next. And this book is really an argument that so many of the things, the most marginalized, the most radical, the most idealistic, the most humane people might have wished for, have come to pass. I think that's confusing for a lot of people who see themselves as radical left, etc., because we're now defending things we've already won rather than starting from scratch trying to get them. We're defending queer and trans rights, women's rights, immigrant rights, the rights of the disabled, of children, economic justice, environmental protection. We're telling radically different stories. But the other thing is, there's a wonderful theologian named Walter Brueggemann who once said, memory breeds hope the way amnesia breeds despair. And a lot of the despair I see, and there's a lot of despair in the world we live in right now, really feels like it comes from that amnesia, that sense that we have no power, we haven't done anything, we're stuck, we're stagnant. And it almost shocks me when I run into it, because what I see is a world that has changed astonishingly. Somebody who had been born, and somebody, if time travel existed, which happily it does not, somebody from 1955 or 65 or 75 or even later would find the world we live in unimaginable and incomprehensible. It's so radically different. And so this is a book about all of that, and also making a couple of arguments that I think might be somewhat fresh. And everybody's familiar with The fact that we had a women's movement, we had gay liberation that turned into LGBTQ rights. We had anti-racist movements. We had environmental movements. We had indigenous rights and anti-colonial movements. We created far more diverse and inclusive societies. All the pieces are familiar, but if you add them up together, because they're so often talked about and balkanized and segregated, if you talk about them separately, they seem familiar. If you look at them all together, you see that we've done something so profound. It, in essence, amounts to dismantling the civilization that I'm old enough to have been born into and partly grew up in, and built a radically different society, which of course brings up the question of backlash. Because what I hear the right saying, particularly in this country, but across white nationalist, Christian nationalist Europe and beyond too, is that they think we're very powerful. They think we've been tremendously successful. They think we've changed the world. And even when we don't believe it, they just want to change it all back because they hate the version we've created in which, at least under the law, women are equal, that this is not the narrow hierarchical world in which straight white Christian men were unquestioningly dominant, in which we could pretend we didn't know about nature so we could keep destroying it. So that's one of the key arguments of the book. The other is that all of these things are moving towards a world that's more interwoven, interrelated, interconnected, which is one of the things that environmental science has been telling us. And breaking down the barriers between that treated men and women as two almost completely separate species between white and non-white, that created a hierarchy there. Seeing gender as on a spectrum and somewhat socially determined rather than some blunt biological facts that lock all of us into one box or the other. That saw human beings back then as really separate from nature. I grew up as a young art critic and a young environmental activist being told that there was a sphere called culture that human beings were in, and there was a sphere called nature that human beings were not in. And nature was a little bit decorative and anachronistic and not that important for the big ideas. And who the fuck thinks like that now that we're in the midst of the climate crisis? So I see it all coming together, and I see the newest science doing something beautiful and remarkable, which is telling a story that completely aligns with the oldest stories, the stories of the land-based and indigenous people who never forgot. And one of the great changes of the last 30-something years, I think, has been in my hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, the resurgence of indigenous people reclaiming land, culture, rights, language, ceremony, but also a role in public life in Ecuador and Bolivia and Canada and Mexico, as well as the US, and bringing this other story with them in ways that I think have been far more transformative than is usually recognized. So that's like a little thumbnail introduction. I'm going to read you a little bit from the book. The indigenous scholar Natalie Avalos at the University of Colorado writes, in the last few years, indigenous peoples have reemerged as a critical voice advocating not just for environmental justice, but for an entirely different way of living and being with the world. She describes the foundation of that view. Native peoples in the Americas understand the universe as alive and sentient. All phenomena in it are understood to be a distinct expression of life force or spirit, since all persons, human and other than human, such as plants, animals, rivers, winds, and mountains, are expressions of spirit. They are understood to be interconnected and contingent. Relatives. The spiritual dimension of the universe is referred to as the spirit world. We people act as stewards of the land, protecting and nurturing the life within it. This reciprocal relationship is mutually self-sustaining. And so the indigenous worldview and the new scientific worldview both describe a world of kind of mutual aid, reciprocity, symbiosis, complementarity, as opposed to the kind of bad social Darwinism based on competition. Which brings me to Margaret Thatcher, who famously said, there is no such thing as society. This was the worldview popular with timber companies. In their view, there was no such thing as a forest, only individual trees competing with other trees to grab enough resources. If that were true, monoculture should eliminate competition, allowing more growth, thereby increasing profit. In practice, the trees in monoculture, if they didn't fail as seedlings, were often sickly and susceptible to infestation and disease, especially if they were planted in soil that lacked the microbial life they needed. A forest is actually, as Suzanne Simard showed us so eloquently in Finding the Mother Tree, a forest is myriad life forms, contributing to each other's survival and growth, even if some of them periodically devour others, and even that devouring helps preserve the whole. A forest is a community, a symbiosis, a society, almost a symphony of lives. There is such a thing as society, even without human beings around. When Suzanne Simard's research on forests outran what the timber industry was willing to sponsor, she went into academia and continued looking for answers to her questions. In 1997, almost a quarter century before her book for general readers, she summarized her work up to that point in a landmark paper in the journal Nature. And I should say, this book is about how we understand the world being changed radically by a series of women scientists. The first in my list in this book is Jane Goodall, breaking the divide that scientists, based, I guess, on lack of careful observation, they were firmly committed to the idea that only human beings had language, had complex societies and emotions and relationships, and used tools. Goodall showed that chimpanzees, in fact, had these emotions, these tools, and these societies. Later research has found a lot of languages, most recently, astonishingly and beautifully, in whales. So then comes Lynn Margulis, who showed that the origins of complex life was not Darwinian division, things splitting off from each other, but symbiosis between two different one-celled life forms to create a more complex single-celled creature that would become the origins of all of us. And that's what's talking right now. That's who's listening right now. And, on to Simard. Simard was exploring interspecies symbiosis in the forest, in which tree roots interacted with fungal networks in the soil to circulate resources in cooperative communities. Simard found that birch trees, regarded as unwelcome intruders and useless weeds by the timber industry, were vital to the well-being of the conifers prized for their lumber, and fungi were vital to the whole. You can't say that plants cooperate without saying they communicate. And Simard says that as well. Or as she said, ecosystems are so similar to human societies. They're built on relationships. The stronger those are, the more resilient the system. We can think of an ecosystem of wolves, caribou, trees, and fungi, creating biodiversity just as an orchestra of woodwind, brass, percussion, and string musicians assemble into a symphony. Metaphors are malleable and usually political, and diversity is now recognized as essential to the health of ecosystems. In fact, we could say that nature has diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll end with a quote from the biologist Brandon Ogbunu, who declared in 2024, modern breakthroughs in biology are producing a picture of life that is increasingly incompatible with authoritarian preferences for neat boxes that dictate what people are and how they should behave. Consequently, biologists must shed the naive belief that our work is apolitical and recognize that the recent attacks on how to teach U.S. history are a battle in a larger war on ideas that includes the natural sciences. So we're in a story battle, an ideas battle, but they're the backlash because we have actually transformed imaginations. And what I see in so many people in your country and mine is a deep respect for these indigenous stories, a deep delight in the new science, a deep yearning for this connection amid the loneliness epidemic, for a connection to each other, but also for a connection to the non-human, to the natural world, and to, to return to the role of stewards that Native people tell us that we're here for. There's so much else to say, and I could talk forever, but I will stop before I do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, for reading to us from the book. And I think it feels appropriate from what you've read, but also how you begin. And this idea of, how we begin and where we begin is important. It's how we choose to tell the stories, right? And that seems to me an absolutely sort of central part of this book. And so I wonder if you could take us to, this hilltop 60 miles north of San Francisco, which is where we meet you right at the start of this book. It is a landscape that is intimate to you. It's where you also grew up. And why did you want to begin this story there? I should add that it's October the 17th, 2024, when we meet you here. The following month, you could have told the story in quite a different way, put it that way.
Yeah.
But this is how you choose to tell it.
On October 17th, 2024, I attended a land rights ceremony in the county I grew up in. I grew up in a place that pretended either that there had been no Native people or they had somehow disappeared a long time ago. And although California has greater linguistic diversity than any place on earth except Papua New Guinea, we were told that these were very primitive people. There wasn't even anything to know about them. And I grew up when most of the US tried to erase Native people, progressive liberal people pretended or thought that what happened to them was very sad, but it was all over. It had happened in our grandparents' or great-grandparents' time. I know Native people, Indigenous people, who've been told to their face that they're extinct, which is an extraordinary thing to say to somebody. But what we've seen since the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival in this hemisphere since 1992 is an incredible resurgence and reclaiming. So that day, on a hillside overlooking the Pacific Ocean, there was a land back ceremony. An environmental organization had helped the local tribe, the Federated Tribe of Great and Rancheria, which is an amalgamation of the Southern Pomo and the Coast Miwok, had reclaimed 600 acres of their land. And in a funny way, 600 acres is not that big. It does not change everything. But if you understand how inconceivable that was, how this tribe did not exist until the year 2000, California tribes were, their existence was denied, their treaties were suppressed. And so heaven and earth had to be moved first for this tribe to come back together, to get recognition, to reclaim land and culture and identity. And then for the rest of us as settler colonialists to understand that they were the original and in many cases the best stewards of the land, and to start giving the land back, rematriating the land, as we say now, because this is not about patriarchy. And, and this is not an isolated thing. It's happening all over California, all over North America. Of course, in 1999, the Inuit and Inuk and other Arctic peoples who had been told up through the 60s that they must assimilate because their culture would inevitably be erased. They got Nunavut, an indigenous governed homeland 3 times the size of Texas, 10 times the size of Britain. Nobody saw that coming in the 60s when, the Canadian government slayed, I think, 50,000 sled dogs to force people off the land back then. The brutality, even so recently, even in the land wars against the Western Shoshone I participated in the 1990s, did not lead, I think, any of us to see this coming. And the fact that Indigenous people never gave up, never surrendered, never stopped that commitment to the land and to cultural preservation is amazing. Of course, in California, one of the big things happened was the biggest undamming of rivers in the country. thinking that eventually the salmon would come all the way back up, and the salmon are sacred and a vital food source for peoples on north coastal California. Within a month, one salmon swam all the way to the headwaters of the river. So I've seen this extraordinary transformation. And a fun footnote, of course, for that land we stood on October 17th, 2024, is that the tribal chair was this remarkable novelist and sort of storyteller named Greg Saris, who was adopted and didn't know he was Native till he grew up. Then got federal recognition for his people, built them a casino, got them a land base, you know, got their needs met, and began to do these remarkable things. And the land came back. And to stand in that place where their very existence was denied and to see them regain power, what a dream, what a miracle, what a transformation. What a thing that would have been hard to explain, long before land back was a catchphrase. I saw it on a baseball cap on a Native guy at the Santa Fe Literary Festival this weekend. So things have changed.
Things have massively changed. I think one of the most sort of exciting, this is a book about change, but one of the most exciting ideas to me in the book, which you touched on in your kind of whistle stop tour through the book at the start, was I love the way you take what I feel is almost like a kind of geological approach to the last sort of few hundred years of industrialized capitalism and colonialism, and you kind of pull back and sort of take this almost, deeper view of time and see the last few hundred years not as a kind of arrival at something or even an end in itself, an end point, which is the narrative we're so often fed in the mainstream and in both of our countries, certainly. And instead, you reposition it as a kind of veering off course. And what your, focuses on is these kind of older stories that kind of way come before, the likes of Christianity or Western traditions and cultures. Can you talk a little bit more about that idea, Rebecca? Because I find that very exciting and hopeful.
Yeah, and again, I'm old. When I was young, people celebrated Christopher Columbus unquestioningly, or most people did. I was born into a world where a lot of Africa was still colonized. I'm less than 15 years younger than, India's liberation of itself from Britain. And
Even the description of, the new world was
yeah.
completely, nobody blinked twice when that was used, even when I was growing up as well.
Yeah. No, and out here in the American West, there were two stories that contradicted each other, one of which this was virgin wilderness. And a lot of environmentalists, when I was young, described the North American continent as somehow uninhabited until white people came, which allowed them to pretend that human beings are inherently destructive and have to be kept separate from nature. Once you acknowledge that people had been here for 10 or 12,000 years, you have to tell a different story. But I want to arc back to the big picture. We can see now what I think maybe in a century historians will call the Columbian mistake, what begins with Christopher Columbus, colonialism, the slave trade of Black people in Africa, the conquest of the Americas, the spread of disease, and colonialism of most of the rest of the world from Europe. Hello, Britain. Scotland, you're slightly off the hook. And
Scotland's not off the hook at all.
The Industrial Revolution, capitalism, there's a kind of divide and conquer and a metaphor behind them all. There's a kind of alienation, an obsession with separation, an assumption that white Christian people are better than everybody else. Sometimes speaking as the granddaughter of Irish Catholics, that gets a little narrower, white Protestant, etc. But it created so many kinds of harm, ecological, cultural, so many genocides, so much death, but also I think so much alienation and division. And I think that in a way, that story has come to an end, and we see people furiously trying to backpedal. And Donald Trump is putting up statues of Christopher fucking Columbus. One of the things that I found so beautiful and exciting about Black Lives Matter and that incredible summer after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis was people understanding that this was about all these forms of oppression, and they not only tore down Confederate statues, but they tore down conquistador statues of the racist, genocidal founders of Canada. They threw that slaver statue into the Bristol Harbor. They, defaced and tore down statues of King Leopold, who committed genocide in the Congo. And people just instinctively understood that this was all connected. And one of the things we've seen in recent years is this great transformation of monuments to start erecting a few of non-male and non-white people and take down some of the more odious white men. And of course, they're trying to reverse that. I don't know how successful that will be. They will get taken down again, I believe, because white Christian men, not only globally, but in the US are a pretty small minority. And they've pitted themselves here against democracy because democracy, that my country will be a non-white majority country in 20 years. And I find that very liberating, speaking as a Catholic Jew who became a Buddhist. So yeah, so I think that we're going to talk about the Columbian mistake, the Columbian half millennium, etc., as this kind of 1492 to 1992. And I do think that Indigenous people in this hemisphere, in part, really all across it, took 1992 as an occasion to fight the version of history very successfully and really transform it. We saw Evo Morales, the first Indigenous president of Bolivia, a complicated figure, Indigenous resurgences in Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico with the Zapatista uprising in 1994, Canada, and the US. And one of my arguments is it's transformed the way the rest of us think about things. And, if you acknowledge this was an inhabited hemisphere all along, then human beings are not inherently destructive and nature is not inherently separate from us, which are two things a little harder to believe in Europe. And in some ways, my European white friends puzzle me. What does it mean to be an Indigenous white person? But we don't have those over here. But that's a whole other conversation.
Because you talk about that sort of the Gramsci quote about the old world dying and this period of dissolution that we are currently in and out of which you have written this book and many of your other books, and this as being the time of monsters. But what I found so galvanizing, I suppose, about this book is that actually those it's not about the rise of monsters in this current moment. It's their sort of final flailing. It's it's a backlash. And to think of it in those terms, it's not the way that that's being spoken of in the culture at all. So this idea of the backlash and of course that sort of really delicious sense that even when we stop believing in ourselves and the work that has to be done, if when we fall into despair, the right wing, the white supremacists, the tech oligarchies, the extractive capitalists, they never stop believing in us.
What a beautiful way to put it. Yeah, they don't. And they want to change everything back. And so I think we have to commit to continuing to change everything forward. And I found the Gramsci quote a very powerful touchstone. And I don't think you said it in full. An old world is dying, a new world is struggling to be born. Now is a time of monsters, is the kind of free translation from the Italian. And I feel like everybody's very aware of the old world that's dying, although we don't acknowledge some parts of it, like patriarchy, kind of are dying, or at least are flailing and anxious and miserable. And we talk about the monsters, and we absolutely should talk about the old world dying. We should talk about the monsters, but because I think they're so well covered, I assigned myself to talk about the new world being born. And maybe something as huge as that can be in the process of birth for decades or centuries, because really this is kind of, I think, the true fulfillment of the Enlightenment in some sense. And there's a great argument from David Wengrow and David Graeber, I cite in the book, their argument that the Enlightenment actually arose in Europe because of the influence of indigenous worldviews on Jesuits and others coming into contact with the native people of the northeast of North America, aka that you know that influence that I think is big now was also big then. The Enlightenment ideas of equality, universal human rights, rational thought, etc., and or at least reasonableness. So we are defending it, but they are the backlash. And yeah, and I love that you point that out because they do tell us over and over and over that we are very powerful and they are frightened of us feminists. They are frightened of us climate activists and environmentalists. They are frightened of us anti-racists, because they actually see us as very powerful. And that's something I learned long ago from being involved in movements. Your enemies often estimate you more truly than you estimate yourself. A lot of progressive left movements underestimate themselves. There's a lot of defeatism and premature despair, etc. I remember with Occupy Wall Street, it scared a lot of financial bigwigs that there was this revolt against economic inequality. And of course, it was largely an American movement, but it did exist in other countries. There was Occupy Kyoto, there was Occupy Auckland, and and feminism scares men who are so committed to their dominance. And I had to think a while back about what is it about what we call marriage equality that is so threatening to people, to conservatives, because theoretically, if Fred and Harold can get married, that doesn't stop Tom and Tina from getting married. And then I realized what it really was is that it wasn't equal access to marriage, it was equality within marriage. If two men or two women can get married, then marriage is a freely negotiated relationship between equals, which to some extent feminists had already realized by changing the legal and cultural expectations and understandings of marriage. And that is a threat to the right, which wants marriage to be a fixed and unchangeable hierarchy between men and, of a dominant husband and a submissive wife. And we're seeing a whole new wave of, as The Guardian called it last week, decentering men with women who are economically independent and, like men, but don't like surrendering their rights, dignity, etc.
Mm. There are sections of this book where you do go back and into that recent past when the world was so very different in so many ways that we sort of don't regularly allow ourselves to chart those ways or remember those ways. And one of the ways that you talk about those changes is just how unbelievably binary everything was. And
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like the counter to the argument for connection and interdependence that you're making about this book. But I thought it was so interesting in light of that. I was watching your interview, Rebecca, with the New York Times, and you said something that really fascinated me because you would think that with your sort of arguments about interdependence and connectedness, that you would be concerned about polarization, and certainly in this country, and I'm sure in the United States as well, polarization has become this like unbelievably dirty word, and it's seen as, the root of all evil in society. And it's almost like the polarization is blamed for the reason, as opposed to the reason why we have become polarized. That somehow gets lost in it. And I was so interested to hear you talk about it as actually there are times when polarization is a kind of normal and just response to extremity. So I wondered if you could speak about that, because this is not something that we hear often. Polarization is bad, bad, bad. That's what we're told.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. That is such a great setup. There was a wonderful progressive writer out of Texas named Jim Hightower who published a book about 30 years ago whose title was There's Nothing in the Middle of the Road But Dead Armadillos. And you don't have armadillos there, but there's this constant idea that like there's this happy medium and we need to meet our opponents halfway. And it's constantly people of color attacks with meeting racists halfway, women with meeting misogynists halfway, anti-Nazis, Jews with meeting, racists and anti-Semites halfway. And and it's always interesting who's supposed to surrender and compromise. I wrote an essay a little while ago, um, right after Joe Biden was elected, where everybody was so worried about how Trump voters might feel about that. In a way, they were never worried about how, like black lesbians felt when Donald Trump was elected. There's a way that conservative white men get consulted all the time as though they matter more than everybody else. And we're supposed to understand them in a way that, like, you don't hear that outcry for like lesbian rabbis and young black Muslims to be understood and met halfway. A lot of times when you're meeting somebody halfway, you're selling out. That's the dead armadillo status you should not aspire to. But also in that New York Times interview, I quoted George Lakey, this wonderful old queer Quaker nonviolence activist who said that polarization is often clarification. And I think in a lot of cases, we've kind of stood still, but they've moved away. And the right is so much more far right in its misogyny, its racism, its anti-environmentalism, its will to violence and destruction, its demonization of non-Christians. It's essentially, in a nutshell, it's white Christian nationalism than it was. If we used to be, we don't need to move closer to where they are because then we move away from defending the things we commit to. I think that there are important ways of reaching out to invite people to join you in supporting universal human rights and absolute equality, of not demonizing some of the people who are not the perpetrators of harm, but kind of the people who've been hoodwinked, sold a pack of lies, told that somehow the world is being overtaken by Muslims or trans kids or whatever. That we want them to leave those beliefs, and we don't get there by being assholes, but at the same time we also don't get anywhere by selling out. Like, what is the point of meeting somebody halfway if you have to abandon everything you believe in to get there? So yeah, polarization, we're in a very polarized moment, which I think is the new world being born in all its majestic inclusiveness, equality, and diversity. And the old world is demanding the opposite of those things, which I guess is homogeneity, inequality, inequity, exclusion, which is the world I was born into. And it was ugly. And Jim Crow was still the law of the land. I'm older than second wave feminism. I've watched all these changes and they're fantastic. So yeah, polarization, like ultimately we want more harmony, but we can't get there by selling out. We have to stand on our values. We have to find ways to communicate them, to invite people in, to explain that they're not threatening, that we're not in a zero-sum game. Because I also think a fundamental difference between us and the far right is ultimately we come from a place of abundance. There is enough for everybody, which is an economic reality, but it's also a social reality. There's enough for everybody to be straight or queer or, cisgender or trans, Muslim or Christian or Hindi or Buddhist or none of the above. You know, and so that scarcity drives so much of the right that there's not enough for everybody. And somehow, if we let the other people have anything, we'll lose what we have. And of course, it's the rhetoric of people who are used to having it all. If you are a straight white Christian man, you used to kind of have everything. And so seeing having your fair share can be seen as a loss. We also need a rhetoric about what you gain. But anyway, that's too complicated. Pardon me. Onward.
No, it's really just so powerful to hear you talking like that because it's such a current kind of disease in this country that, the left feels it should be, devoted to centrism. And meanwhile, you've got the rise of the likes of reform and all these problems, that never really went away. The sort of deep-seated racism in this country that dates back to colonialism, and so much of it is seen as a failure of the left. And I wondered, how much you feel in your kind of repositioning of the narratives and the changing of focus, how much we should be focused on, the failures on the left or the evils on the right, and how much we should just be looking at completely different stories, because actually instead of going into some of those sorts of back and forth debates in this book, you sort of push those hundreds of years to one side and talk about much older stories that are really to do with kind of indigenous worldviews and African and Asian religions and cultures.
Yeah, in a way, another way that I think that the Colombian mistake is coming to an end, it might be more true in my country than yours, but both indigenous and non-Western worldviews, Asian religions, and I'm actually here at a Zen center in Santa Fe, in this very moment. I could turn this around and show you a Tibetan tanka, and but that would be complicated on Zoom. And
Maybe let's save that for the finale. It sounds fantastic.
okay, okay. What was I going to say? But I think a lot of ideas have come from elsewhere that have been more influential than people think. I not that many people, for example, in North America would say they're Buddhist, but then I asked actually, I was doing a conversation with Anand Guru who was very skeptical about how influential Buddhism is in North America. So I asked the audience, and 50% of them raised their hands because the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh and people like that have really opened up ideas about compassion, non-separation, and ways of being in the world that I think are really different. In the same way that Indigenous people have opened up an idea of kind of non-separation from the natural world and a kind of deep and meaningful and spiritual relationship with it, which has been emerging also, I think, from Indigenous European traditions and other places. But it does, all added up, constitute a profound reorientation and in who we are, how we think about ourselves. I want to backtrack a little bit to talk about the whole right-left thing and who's supposed to meet who halfway. I wrote an essay in my newsletter I go back to all the time called the "She Made Him Do It" theory of everything, because I think that the left, and in the US, the Democratic Party, I don't know if it's true of labor over there, is coded as the wife in a bad marriage. And she should just cook better dinners, placate him, not ruffle his feathers. There's a way we constantly see the right as reactive, and it's our job to not push their buttons, as though we made them racist, we made them destructive, we made them hateful, we made them do it. And that was the old way before feminism of like, oh, he beat her, she made him do it. She should have, been more meek and mild and submissive and domestic and whatever. And so there's this way in which we excuse the right for being hateful, destructive, um, just kind of monstrous, as though everybody but they are responsible for it. It's naturalized as though you live in a country that's a little bit less white and patriarchal than it used to be. Like, oh, how can they stand that? And it's like, go talk to somebody who is never white and Christian about how they've managed to get through their life so far. You might know something about that. And, so. But I do see and I see the blowback and the pushback, and it's huge, but against real change. And I think that's important to see that in a way, it's a mark of our victories that they want to change it back because we changed it forward.
Hmm. It's also an argument for sort of a pluralism, isn't it? And there are lovely
Yeah.
sections of this book where you talk about, the sort of the fiction of individualism doesn't even work at the level of the self, which, we now know is made up of all of this kind of, a collective of
Yeah.
bacteria and, things that we are barely only aware of and are only now discovering. And so this sort of idea of kind of everything happening at once and the beginning comes after the end, but it's not just one beginning really, nor is it one ending, I suppose. It's a pluralism of it's a kind of chaos. But perhaps we've been too afraid of chaos.
Yeah, but it's actually there's a kind of, once you define people as autonomous individuals, you start slouching towards social Darwinism, the idea that they're all in competition with each other. David Graeber once remarked that everything is socialism. Capitalism is just the worst way to do socialism, because even capitalism is based much more on cooperation, say within a corporation, than competition between. But yeah, we now know that all of us should use they, them pronouns because half the DNA, half the cells in our body don't have human DNA. We are a lurching colony, or not a colony, terrible word, scratch that, but a lurching, community of microorganisms that without which we would die. But also, and it's funny because when I was talking to Anand, I think he was a little anxious about the idea of there's no such thing as an individual. But in the sense, not in the sense that we don't get to be our weird, quirky, creative selves, but even that weird, quirky, creative self exists within culture, within community, within a larger conversation. Even if you're reacting against something, you're living in an ecosystem with that thing you're reacting against. And then, of course, in a biological sense, you did not give birth to yourself, you did not raise yourself. Chances are very high you're eating food that other people grew, wearing clothes that other people sewed, living in a world built by others, communicating with a language built by countless people over countless generations, educated essentially by learning what other people knew. You never exist out of relationship to all those things. There is no self-made man. There is always such thing as society. And so understanding that relationship, which of course begets a certain amount of responsibility, um, I think is really important, but it doesn't feel oppressive to me. A point I want to throw in, though, is that the right is very committed to what I call the ideology of isolation, that lack of responsibility for others, whether it's feeding the hungry or protecting the environment. And climate science and is so offensive to them because it is the ultimate science of everything is connected to everything else. When we dig up and burn fossil fuel, it goes into the upper atmosphere, thickening the insulating blanket around the earth, raising temperatures, unleashing climate chaos. Therefore, we have to rethink how we power our machines, how we generate energy, but also what we eat, how we live, what our agriculture and transit and housing and everything else looks like. And that's responsibility, but it's also a beautiful vision of interconnection. Their ugly, fragmentary, competitive, isolated world, I think is really sad and ugly. And you kind of feel sorry for people stuck in that worldview in which everyone is the enemy. And you end up being one of those stupid guys in their cargo shorts carrying a weapon of war in the shopping mall in one of those states that allows open carry. Fortunately, I don't spend time in them, but they're out there. And, why do you need to go buy shoelaces with an AK-47 strapped to your pot belly? You don't have to answer that because that's not you.
Yes, I do. I have no answer for that. Well, I feel it's apt that we've given the people who you call the disconnectors in this book, you've given them a chapter, and I feel like we've given them about as much space in this conversation as well, which is pleasing. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You in that same New York Times interview, you said that you're sometimes known as the Hope Lady, which I love. And who doesn't want to be the Hope Lady or be in the company of the Hope Lady? But what happens, Rebecca, when, on those days when hope does dim, for all sorts of reasons? For example, the last time we met that June day in 2022 on the day of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. What are some of the things that you do or that you think or that you return to, or whether it's, philosophies or particular thinkers or even just going out and doing and seeing in the world and noticing that kind of help the Hope Lady to recharge?
The Hope Lady's just a joke from my friend Sam, and but I do not reject the title. The word hope is troublesome for people, partly because they often confuse it with optimism. Optimism, I think, is passive. It assumes everything will be fine and nothing is required of us, which makes it very much like despair, pessimism, and cynicism, which also require very little of us. Hope for me just means there are possibilities. And again, I'm finding myself talking a lot about responsibility. If there are possibilities, we have some kind of moral responsibility to seize them, but also an invitation that I think can be lovely. When I did that New York Times interview, Emily Atkin, who's an extraordinary climate journalist in the US with a newsletter called Heated, said that, and you could tell she was like very kind of allergic to the word hope, but it made her feel kind of hopeful. And so I said to her, this is on Blue Sky. Now it's my pinned Blue Sky, whatever. I said, well, if the word hope doesn't sit well with you, try never fucking surrender. And I've gone back to that because that's what really it's about. I Let us not surrender the vulnerable to the worst case scenario, whether it's genocide in Palestine, starvation in Africa, various forms of oppression in our countries, etc. Because I often find that this optimism, pessimism, cynicism, doomerism is being expressed on the part of the relatively safe and comfortable, and I see it as breaking solidarity. But I also know that our enemies love us to believe that we have no power, we can never win, it's not worth trying. They love us to give up. And even summoning up all my old punk rock self, even if the odds don't feel good, why the hell give them the satisfaction? And why surrender? If you don't try, you will definitely not succeed. If you do, you might fail. And I think people are often afraid of that failure if they try. And that's of course true in personal relationships too, that vulnerability, that risk taking. But I want us to be brave. I want us to try. And I actually think we're in a really interesting moment. I've spent the last 10 years hearing everybody say, oh, authoritarianism is in the ascendance. And really, I was writing my newsletter and watching the returns on Hungary. And really, I think a lot of people thought Orban had rigged the system and could not be defeated. And then he was. And this really extraordinary things happened only really in the last few weeks. Orban, who was a kingpin funding the US and global right movement, lost, and he lost decisively. And he's really pretty over. And a lot of his little evil networks of support are over. Putin is quite possibly losing the war in Ukraine. And whatever comes of it, Russia has been badly weakened and isolated by attacking Ukraine. It's been said that Russia fought a 20th century war, but Ukraine fought a 21st century war. And then Donald Trump, and the guy is literally rotting on the hoof. You look at his bruised hands, his naps in public, etc. I just think of him as being like the kind of thing supermarkets throw out in the bins behind, the shop. He is in a state of advanced mental, physical, and political decay. The US right is waning. Who saw that coming? But people told us that the future would look like the present, only more so. And I wrote about that the other day. People just constantly project that the future will just expand some obvious thing in the present, as though history marches like a tank on some very straight path. History, as I wrote long ago in Hope in the Dark, is a crab scuttling sideways, is water wearing away stone, is tension building up until the earthquake erupts. History is not linear. History zigzags, it backflips, it erupts. And it is just so interesting that even compared to a few months ago, this whole idea that global authoritarianism is, in the saddle and here to stay doesn't look that good. But please defeat reform and please make Ed Miliband Prime Minister. I actually got to do a podcast with him, and he is a very cool climate guy. Sorry
Cool.
to campaign on him today.
Well,
We might elect a
The
climate.
Green Party is in ascendance as well,
Oh, I would take that too. I
in
would
this
take that
country.
too.
So yeah, so
Yeah.
you're right. You're right. There are different ways to tell the story, for sure. Right. Let's take some questions, I think.
Okay.
I believe people are either to put up their hands or write into the chat box.
Okay.
Okay. Is it Jenny? Do you want to unmute yourself and you can ask your question? Thank you.
That you? You want to say anything?
Okay.
Ooh, I can't hear anything. Maybe
No,
we
I
need.
can't hear anything either.
Okay. We might need written questions.
Yes, perhaps.
But
Okay. Can we get some questions into the group chat, please? Well, while we're waiting, I'm sure there are many. Am I looking in the right place?
okay. We could keep talking because I love your
Yes,
question.
yes, keep talking. And
Okay, we'll keep talking for now. One of my favorite chapters, Rebecca, is the single garment of destiny. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that, because in that particular chapter, you're really talking about some of the ideas that you've just been elucidating in that kind of concluding passage of, interconnection, and also like sometimes how seemingly sort of quite disparate movements are in fact have got their eyes on the same goals and the same objectives and the same loves and the same cares. And you talk specifically about Rachel Carson and Martin Luther King Jr. Tell us a bit about that story.
Yeah, one of the reasons I love being a writer is it forces me to think harder than I would otherwise. And I went back to those two people who were so transformative, particularly in this country, but I think beyond, and really understood them a new way. Because what was Rachel Carson telling us in Silent Spring, her book about the harm that herbicides and pesticides and other chemical poisons were doing? What she was telling us is that those, those chemicals are actually very good at what they do. Initially, they kill the insect you want to kill, they kill the plant you want to kill, but the problem is that they keep on poison. The poison keeps on traveling through the ecosystem. It kills beneficial insects, it kills birds, it pollutes rivers, kills fish, gives people cancer, kills us, poisons the soil, creates dead zones, breaks up complex ecologies. So essentially, Rachel Carson was saying, because everything is connected, you cannot just throw poison into one part of a system and think that it stays there. And so what really drove her vision was a deep sense of ecological interconnection that I think most people did not have at that point. And it really pushed what I think of as a conservation movement that just wanted to protect pretty places by putting a fence around them and separating them from industrialism and destruction. And so it shifts the conservation movement into the environmental movement, which is a big conceptual transformation, because from separating places to recognizing that it's all inseparable. And Martin Luther King, at the same time, his gospel of love was about the fact that we are all connected, and there were Black movements that wanted Black separatism because white people were so awful. But Martin Luther King wanted desegregation, wanted a fellowship of man, wanted the beloved community. And his gospel of love was also about recognizing that in truth, we were never separate, that segregation, racism, Jim Crow, etc., were attempts to create these destructive divisions. And so he too had a vision of indivisibility that's present so much in so many of his quotes. It's why one of the three epitaphs for this book is his beautiful, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. He has so many passages that sound like Buddhism, like ecological thinking, like indigenous thinking now. He was such a prophet in that sense. And so it's really fun to rediscover them and to really see them as aligned as two of the many people in a revolution that's gathers force in the 60s, but still hasn't ended. We're in the middle of this beginning. It had, we're not, as is often said, like, oh, we had a feminist revolution or we had an environmental revolution or whatever. Like, we're still in the early stages of rethinking everything and understanding how to live if these principles are true, if we live by them. And exciting things are happening around the climate possibilities and human possibilities, everything with this new vision of inseparability that is both moral and ecological.
Thank you, Rebecca. I love that. I love that. Right, we have many questions now. Let's start with this one. Can you speak about the ever worsening situation in Palestine and the global weaponization of anti-Semitism and where you look to for hope in that particular situation?
I don't know about hope in that situation. One thing that I find fascinating and disturbing is that it's constantly described as a binary in which if Palestinians lose, then somehow Israel is winning. And what I feel like we've watched Israel do is in many ways destroy itself. It's lost. I know there's a bunch of annoying regimes, including, your country's leadership in mine, that defend Israel, and that in the UK and Germany even kind of outlaw certain kinds of protest and speech. But Israel has made itself far weaker. I think that in the same way Germany is still living with the history of what it's done, Israel will live with the history of what it's done. And it's surrounded by Muslim countries. What the hell did they think the consequences would be? And I love and respect the Jews and the Israeli Jews and Palestinians or Muslim Israelis working together who recognize what I believe, that the only solution is coexistence. You can destroy the physical place of Gaza, but you cannot make Palestinians go away in that sense, except by some kind of final solution that Netanyahu seems willing to enter into. It's also striking that the whole fucking war was basically Netanyahu trying to stay one step ahead of his criminal record, in the same way that Donald Trump, with his attacks in Venezuela and the Caribbean and Iran, is also trying to distract people from his criminality, including the Epstein business. But so, I just I found it so weird that people told this as a simple binary, that one side would win. I think Israel has lost tremendously over the last 3 years, and that we will see consequences internationally. And what happens to a Palestinian kid who lost a leg in all their family? Who will that person be when they're 25? I fear that they're breeding ongoing war through those atrocities. It's also been horrible seeing both left and right do stupid things about pretend that being against the Israeli government, the Netanyahu regime, is being anti-Semitic. I'm half Jewish. I am very against the Netanyahu regime. And it really feels like a dirty trick that the right has played to suppress free speech. Every government is open to criticism, and there is left-wing anti-Semitism as well as right-wing anti-Semitism, but it does not consist of blaming a government. It consists of somehow pretending, and this is something I run into a lot, that all Jews support this, when even in Israel, and there's been this stupid equations that all Israelis are Jews when less than 80% of Israelis are Jews. All Jews globally support the Israeli government when even Israelis don't all support the current Israeli government, etc. There's a funny way in which discrimination is always tied to indiscriminateness. All Muslims are like this, all Black people are like that, all trans people are like this, all Jews are like this. You have to pretend they're homogenous so you can engage in collective punishment and stereotyping. And we're seeing it happen on all those fronts. And there was a horrible anti-Muslim massacre or attempted massacre that killed 3 Muslims, and then the teenagers killed themselves in San Diego, California yesterday. And I blame to some extent the Trump administration, which has raised again the kind of anti-Muslim sentiment that was such a part of the Bush administration and a wave of anti-Muslim violence in this country then. But I think Israel has lost, and I think it will wake up to find out that's true in the decades to come. I think it was an act of self-destruction. And somewhere in this book, I quote Judith Butler. They say that the best argument against violence is that because we are not separate, when I harm you, I harm myself. And I think Israel has deeply harmed itself in so many ways, which doesn't mean that somehow Israel matters more than Palestine, or Israeli lives matter more than Palestinian lives, or that October 7th was okay. But I do think Israel has harmed itself deeply, and that the binary blinds people from seeing that in a sense, you can tell this other than a two-side story, that there's many sides or one side.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. We've got a hand raised. Is it Janice? And yeah, please turn off your.
It's actually Rich and Janice.
Sorry, Rich.
It's okay. In Detroit, Michigan, and I work with the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center to nurture community leadership. So it's an honor to see you, to hear the voice of that you're sharing with us in Detroit for more than 40 years now, 50 years. I can't even remember when you came here. I invite folks to come see the future, because the freedom that we're talking about is taking place on the ground in Detroit, and the future came out of the past. My question is a very simple one, or not so simple. Can you expand more on the age of rights versus the end of the age of rights on the one hand, and the birth of the age of responsibility?
I don't think they're separate. My responsibility towards you is to respect your rights. And, and one of the things I find so exciting in this moment, and I write about in this book, and my friend Rob McFarlane writes about in his most recent book, is the rights of nature, which again comes out of indigenous worldviews. The rivers have been granted personhood and rights in Peru and Ecuador, Canada, New Zealand, etc. And nature, and so I think we're in this remarkable era. I have a lot more rights than I did when I was born. And I talked a little bit about marriage equality earlier. There's this moment I keep bringing up because it's such a perfect illustration. The somewhat intrusive interviewer, Terry Gross, once asked Gloria Steinem, one of the leaders of second wave feminism, or sort of said in this, like, oh, so you didn't get married for the first time till you're in your 60s. And Gloria Steinem said, if I had gotten married as a young woman in the 60s, I would have surrendered so many rights to my husband. My right against marital rape, my right to economic self-determination, etc. We live in an era of radically expanding rights and, of course, a huge backlash against it. And I think seeing it expand beyond the human is a beautiful thing. But I think also something that's perfectly aligned with that we haven't mentioned, but I think is so exciting, is the underneath idea of equality is a kind of kindness, which is also a kind of kinship. They're etymologically related. The kinds of normalized brutality of teachers to beat students, of husbands to beat wives, parents to beat children, of bosses over employees, of various kinds of people to be atop hierarchies from which they could brutalize those with lower standing. We have dismantled those in some ways. There's an essay I never wrote with the title "We Are All Anarchists Now," and that we do not accept that kind of bullying by the police, or the military of citizens, by certain kinds of people of certain kinds of other people. We've created a world in which people who were not heard, women and children and testifying, and men for that matter, testifying about sexual abuse. And the whole reason the Epstein thing has erupted is because feminism created a space in which those stories could be heard, that were not heard at the time that the violent abuse of children was happening. You all have Jimmy Savile. Did I get his name right? What the hell society was it where hundreds of children were so unable to be heard, believed, supported, that they could not testify, so that guys like him got away with so much abuse. I was really moved by Princess Diana's brother testifying about the brutalities of the school he was sent to, and he was about my age. And so I see that we actually live in a world of far more rights, not even just under the law, but just assumptions. What can I as a parent or teacher do to this child? What can I as a husband do to this wife? What can I as a man do to this woman? We think about that overall in radically different ways, and we see a lot of the ugliness exposed. One of the things that I'm coming to learn is that when you give people a voice and rights, some of the first stories they have to tell is about the terrible things that happened to them when they didn't have rights. For example, the stories First Nations Canadians are telling about the incredibly horrific abuse and cultural genocides in the boarding schools, and which also happened here in the US. But I think despite everything, in my lifetime, I like how normal it was that Africa was mostly colonies, in the post-war era, and how colonization wasn't even seen as a bad thing. In the culture I grew up in, and most of you listening grew up in, and we have seen such an expansion of rights. And I don't think that can truly go backward, because you had to create this strange world in which only a very few people did have voices and controlled who else could be heard, how the story was told, who had rights to create that world. And now that so many more of us in the global South, who are women, who are queer, who are non-white, who are non-Christian, have voices, we know what it's like to be free. We've tasted freedom and equality and democracy. We've tasted what it's like to have rights. Chitra and I had this extraordinary conversation on June 24th, 2022, which was not only my birthday, but the day Roe versus Wade was overturned. They can take away your rights under the law, but that's temporary, because they can't take away your belief in your rights. I think now that women have experienced what it's like to live in a world where you have bodily self-determination, you have the right to set your boundaries, you have the right to control your fertility. We don't want to go back. We're not going to go back. And you can change the law, but you can't change the belief in those rights. And as long as women have the vote, and I don't think that's going back either. And my grandmothers were born before women had the vote in this country or your country. We will insist on our rights. We will fight for our rights. And the funny thing in the US is there are more abortions than ever before, because medicine abortions have become very widespread, even in the states where access to abortion is not supposed to exist. That was a tirade, but it's such a good question. I feel so strongly about it. And God, I want to talk about Grace Lee Boggs, but I just talked too long, and I don't know where we are, but I know we're probably over time.
We are indeed, but that feels like a really powerful place to close. Rebecca, you've been so generous with your time and your thinking and your talking, and this is such a exciting and exhilarating book, and I really would encourage everyone to read it. So thank you so much, Rebecca. It's just been an absolute privilege for me to once again be in conversation with you. And I'm going to switch back to Lisa now, I believe, who's going to wrap things up very professionally.
Oh, well, thank you massively to Chitra and Rebecca. What a fascinating evening of conversation that we've had, thought-provoking and challenging to how we can communicate better, how we can cooperate better, and how we can keep some of that hope too. And I think it's, tonight's conversation has been insightful and reminds us of the importance of events like this, of conversations like this, of keeping reading and listening to each other. So I would like to thank Rebecca first and foremost for sharing, and as Chitra has said, being so generous this evening, and Chitra for doing a fantastic job of getting that information out and bringing those key points. And I would go back to, I think, where you actually started, where we say, it's up to us, really, isn't it, about how we choose to tell our stories. And I want to thank you for that. And I hope you all enjoyed this evening's session. Thank you again for joining us. Do keep checking out what we've got to offer and writing on the wall. We've got some more events. And if you are in Liverpool, you can come and see us face to face, but we look forward to catching up for those of you a little further afield online again too. So thank you very much.